Hello and welcome back to the Nutrition and Life podcast. My name is Lisa, I'm your host, and today I have the absolute pleasure of speaking with scientist, author, and coach James Krieger from Weightology and the editor-in-chief of the Reps Research Review. Welcome to our podcast, James.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's my absolute pleasure, and I'd love to just start off with who you are, how you got into what you do today. I have lots of questions prepared for you, but I would love to just get to know you a little bit before we dive into it.
Yeah, I've been in the industry for a long time. I started. It started. I was actually a computer science guy way back in college, back in the '90s, and but just got more interested in the science of exercise and stuff, and so I ended up changing my major and all that stuff, and ended up going to grad school, getting my master's degree in exercise science, then got a second master's in nutrition, and um, started writing stuff all the way back in like 2001. I was, excuse me, the science editor for Pure Power magazine all the way back then, and have been writing content of some type ever since. And then obviously have published a number of studies too, either from my grad work or collaborating with people like Brad Schoenfeld and running the stats on some of his studies. Not really doing that anymore, but that's stuff that I used to do quite a bit of. So.
Amazing. Well, I appreciate all that you do because truly I've seen you as a co-author or lead author on many, many things. And yeah, not to the least of it now with all the great stuff that you put out with the Reps Research Review together with Lane Norton. And several of those topics that I have seen appear in that research review is what I would kind of like to dig into a little bit more. First
Yeah.
of all, the one that has piqued my interest the most was one that was talking about the impact of ultra-processed diets on calories and weight gain. I'm interested in that because, well, I've come from a background of like thinking all I need to do is clean eat, or all I need to do is cut out carbs and whatever. And then when I've learned about the concept of energy balance, I felt super liberated and just we went a little bit too far on the flexible dieting side of things, I guess, when it comes to processed foods. And now I'm happy to say that I've found a happy middle with 80-90% whole foods and some processed foods. But nonetheless, why don't you tell us about what that article was essentially about?
So, um, yeah, the thing about ultra processed foods, and I'm trying to remember maybe what issue that was in, uh, uh, but I can speak more general in terms of the thing about ultra processed foods. Obviously, there's some research that suggests there's an association between ultra processed food consumption and weight gain. But it's not quite so simple in the sense that, just because a food's ultra processed, it doesn't mean you're automatically going to overeat it. Kevin Hall has done a number of studies on this. In fact, we've actually got in the next issue coming up in Reps, we've got another piece on ultra processed foods. I think Astrid Naranjo is writing it. Looking at chewing rate and consumption of ultra processed foods. So like we do know that there does tend to be people may tend to overconsume processed foods more easily than whole foods. The mechanisms is like we don't know what it is. Is it food reward? For example, we just had an article in Reps. It used to be believed, well, maybe it's the dopamine response, right, by ultra processed foods. So and so they had that was one Reps article we recently just had. I think Adrian Chavez wrote that one where they had people drink a milkshake, and I actually think this was a Kevin Hall study. They had people drink a milkshake. They measured the dopamine response in the brain, so basically the reward response. But they found that there was no correlation between the reward response and how much people consumed. So that tended to contradict the idea that, oh, well, maybe maybe it's the reward response in the brain from eating some of these ultra processed foods or whatever. We've got another paper, like I said, that's going to come out in the next issue looking at chewing rate. And it could be that when you consume ultra processed foods, it's literally just easier to eat it, right? You don't have to chew it as much. And it's just easier. You can consume it much quicker. And so maybe there's a mechanism there. Kevin Hall's had some other work done on ultra processed foods. He had a really good one that I remember covering in the Weightology research review. This is before I became the editor-in-chief for Reps. It was they compared people consuming a whole food diet to an ultra processed diet, and the people consumed like over 500 calories per day more on the ultra processed diet. But at the time, they didn't really know why. They couldn't say, well, is it chewing rate? Is it the food reward? Is it, so the mechanisms we don't really know. And that's, I think, what's being explored right now. And that's not to say that all ultra processed food is going to make you overeat. I mean, a lot of us in the fitness industry love to have protein drinks. I mean, a protein drink is literally an ultra processed food, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean when you have protein drinks, you're suddenly going to start over consuming things. So it's not always just as simple as saying, oh, if it's ultra processed, you're going to overeat. But there is this tendency, depending on what you're eating, it can be easier to overeat some ultra processed foods. And obviously, it just makes it harder to, maintain a caloric deficit and everything, when you're consuming more ultra processed food. So it's not that ultra processed foods are bad. It's just that if you err on the side of more whole foods, you're probably going to have better appetite control, So
Yes, from personal experience or just from my personal view, I can absolutely underline that or subscribe to the idea of it just being quicker. So, I mean, when we sit together and there's lots of food on the table and we want to sit there and have a meal for, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes, and you have something that's super, super processed and you finish that in 5 minutes, you're probably just going to keep on eating because there's more food on
yeah.
the table as opposed to having to go through that chewing process and all of that. So I can absolutely imagine that would be a contributing factor. Yeah, you are of course also covering some wonderful topics in regards to training. But one other thing that I wanted to talk about purely when it comes to nutrition is insulin. And insulin, one headline that kind of caught my eye was where you were saying insulin is still receiving an undeserved bad reputation even years down the road. And maybe you can explain what you mean with that, because a lot of people nowadays, they have a CGM and then they talk about, oh, my blood sugar was spiked and blah blah, and they try to avoid that by any cost. But yeah, maybe educate us on what insulin, why it's an undeserved bad reputation.
Yeah, I think this was kind of speared by the low carb movement, by Gary Taubes and others, that it's this overly simplistic notion that people see insulin as a storage hormone, and so they think, oh well, they make this simplistic connection in their heads that, oh well, if I eat more carbohydrate, my insulin goes up. I know that insulin suppresses lipolysis and everything. And maybe it's a storage hormone. Maybe it helps shuttle glucose into fat cells. So obviously, if I eat high carb, I'm going to get more fat and everything. The big problem with that viewpoint is insulin does not operate in a vacuum in your body. It's not like it's the only hormone in your body. There's literally like dozens of hormones and other factors all simultaneously interacting with insulin at the same time. And it's not all just the impacts of insulin, for example, on, let's say, muscle cells or fat cells. Insulin also has an impact on the brain. So what a lot of people don't realize is that insulin, for example, helps actually feed back on your brain, interacts with your brain to tell you to eat less, right? So it's like in some ways, it's a satiety signal to say, hey, okay, we shouldn't eat as much. And in fact, we know from rodent studies, if you knock out insulin receptors in the brain of rodents, they will overeat. They will actually overeat and become fat because their brains aren't sensing the insulin. So insulin is actually very, very important. Um, and it's a really easy hypothesis to test. And it's been tested. And again, I mentioned Kevin Hall's work because he's done so much just beautiful work in this area, highly controlled metabolic ward studies, things like that. It's a really easy hypothesis to test. If insulin is really this bad guy, all you got to do is have two groups. One consumes low carb, one consumes high carb, but they consume the same number of calories. And if insulin is really a problem, then the group that does low carb should lose more fat. I mean, it should be that simple. Well, they've done metabolic ward studies on this, and that's not true. It's literally the fat loss is identical. If anything, the fat loss tends to be a little bit greater in the high carb group. But I mean, it's so small that it's really from a practical standpoint, it doesn't matter. So it knocks that whole idea out of the water because again, insulin doesn't operate in a vacuum. If you're in a deficit, it doesn't whether your insulin is spiking or whatever, or your glucose is spiking doesn't matter because what really matters is, are you storing more over a 24-hour period than you're expending? Like that's all that's all that matters. And you could eat all the carbs in the world. And if you're not storing more than you're expending over 24 hours, the insulin is literally irrelevant. It's completely irrelevant. And so, yeah, and that's just been confirmed by study after study now, and yet, I think people get hung up on the idea they think there's something to it because what happens when a lot of people go on low carb diets, they do lose weight. Like they start to lose weight and they think, oh, well, maybe it was the insulin, maybe it was the carbs, and they don't realize that low carb dieting is just a way for some people to eat less without necessarily thinking about it. And the mechanisms could be a variety of mechanisms. It could be usually when people go low carb, they increase their protein intake. We do know that protein helps with satiety. Also, people, when they go low carb, they tend to eliminate some of the high sugar, high reward, very calorically dense foods. So, that automatically, plays a role. And then also a lot of times when people go low carb, their diet tends to just have very less variety. We know just food variety in general. We call it the buffet effect. Like when you have a bigger variety of foods, there's a reason when you go to a buffet, you always end up eating more than if you just had like a plate of food in front of you, right? And that's called the buffet effect. That's even true in rodents. They found that in rodent studies. You give them a wider variety of stuff, they will eat more. Sometimes we call it what's called sensory specific satiety, where it kind of explains why you could have this big heavy meal of steak and potatoes or whatever, but you still have room for dessert. And the reason is because that dessert stimulates has a different sensory aspect to it than the meat and the potatoes and all that stuff do. And so that's called sensory specific satiety. You're full on meat and potatoes. You certainly don't want to eat any more of that. But wait, the dessert sounds pretty good. That's something totally different, and I'll eat more of that. And so, so typically when people go on low carb diets, that variety goes down, and even that helps them spontaneously eat less. So there's a number of reasons why low carb dieting can work for people, but it's got nothing to do with insulin, so.
Really interesting, and I love how you just laid that out very clearly for us, and that the research really doesn't underline any of that. I mean, in terms of insulin, what I always think is underestimated is the impact that it has on hypertrophy and just strength in general. So when people talk about always keeping insulin low, my concern is like, okay, well, if you're simultaneously interested in hypertrophy, maybe you are perhaps cutting yourself a little bit there short when it comes to the potential gains. Is there, and do you have any opinion on that?
Yeah, actually, we just covered that in a recent issue of Reps. I think it was a meta-analysis, and I don't remember who covered that article. It might have been Brandon Roberts, but I don't remember for sure. Yeah, there was a recent meta-analysis on that suggested that low-carb diets or ketogenic diets may not necessarily be optimal for hypertrophy. The data wasn't totally clear on that. but it was kind of leaning towards that way. And whether it's because when you go low carb, maybe it affects training performance, um, you know, um, that's a possibility. Maybe again, when you go low carb, maybe it's harder to eat enough, especially if you're trying to be in a surplus for hypertrophy. Obviously, it's not a protein intake issue because you'll still have plenty of protein, but um, so there is some data to suggest that if you are trying to gain as much muscle as possible, keto diets, and I say it's not definitive. Um, like there's a chance it may not necessarily be the optimal approach if you're trying to put on as much muscle as possible. So
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, let's shift a little bit more into the training side of things, or speaking of, since we're speaking of hypertrophy. And overall, I would love to hear a bit more about what impact resistance training just has on energy expenditure, because sometimes when we want people to lose fat, we say to them also, hey, let's start a strength training program, but not explaining properly that it's not necessarily for the purposes of burning calories throughout that resistance training, perhaps.
yeah, the energy expenditure you get from resistance training is pretty low. I mean, even if you train pretty hard and do a lot of volume, it's still like, I mean, I'd say your average person is not going to expend more than 50 to 100 calories in a resistance training session. I mean, really, that's it. Now you will get a little bit, I would call an afterburn effect, because muscle protein synthesis is elevated for, 24, 48 hours after a training session. You get some extra energy expenditure, from that. But even then, you know, it might be an extra 50 to 100 calories over another 24 hours. So we're not talking massive energy expenditure benefits to resistance training. Um, uh, you know, um, there's again, there's obviously some benefit there, but it's very small. And I think people tend to overestimate the benefit. I think the big benefits from resistance training for fat loss specifically are twofold. Well, number one, you're going to maintain your muscle mass when dieting. I mean, you pretty much need to resistance train to maintain your muscle while dieting. Now, if you're a completely untrained person, we do know that cardio will actually help you maintain some muscle too, at least in the lower body and stuff. But if you're a more advanced trainee, I mean, obviously you gotta resistance train if you want to keep your muscle while dieting. So that's the first benefit. Um, there's some, although it's fairly weak evidence, depending on how you train, maybe of some appetite benefits, maybe appetite control benefits. Again, that data is not really clear at this point. But there's obviously a possible benefit. And a third benefit that might be, I would say, more of an indirect benefit on energy expenditure is a potential impact. And this is something I've written about a lot, or at least anyone who's been to my site, you mentioned insulin and undeserved bad reputation. That's always been a big thing on my site. I've also written a lot about NEAT, or non-exercise activity thermogenesis, and I've given a lot of presentations on it. And that's just kind of your natural, spontaneous physical activity during the day. We know that when you lose weight, your NEAT tends to kind of go down without even you really realizing that it's happening. And there's some evidence, again, it's not really strong at this point, that resistance training may actually counteract that a little bit, so that your NEAT doesn't go down as much, when you're trying to lose weight. And so there's an indirect benefit to energy expenditure that way. So it's not necessarily the burning the calories during the resistance training session, but it's more, it might be helping you unconsciously keep your NEAT up a little bit more each day, which can actually definitely impact your energy expenditure, in a more significant way, because we don't NEAT can actually have a pretty powerful role on daily energy expenditure. I mean, it's why, I don't coach clients anymore, but, when I used to, like, I would always have them wear pedometers or activity monitors because I wanted them to try to just move around as much as possible every day, just to try to keep their NEAT levels up. So.
Awesome. And I'm curious, what does the research say when it comes to how much energy muscle mass burns versus fat mass? Because sometimes we hear, oh, you should put on muscle in order to increase your metabolism and blah, 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 blah. How much is to that?
Yeah, it's actually not much. It's again, I'm not saying building muscle is great. I mean, I'm 100% obviously supportive of it, but the energy expenditure benefit you're going to get from it is pretty small, and it turns out it's only about maybe estimates vary a little bit, but maybe around 6 calories per pound of muscle. So literally, if you had 10 pounds of muscle, your daily energy expenditure is only going to go up by about 60 calories a day. So it's not going to turn you into a calorie burning machine. Um, Again, there's other benefits to building muscle. So, but turning yourself into this calorie burning machine isn't going to be one of them. So,
Yeah, I could imagine that some of it might work more indirectly, perhaps through the muscle mass or through the training, eliciting some hormone improvements and some, leptin and ghrelin regulation improvements, or just that's just what I'm kind of imagining could be happening there. But yeah, I was something else interesting that I wanted to talk about is kind of what training volume we really need in order to maintain our muscle mass because we might go through busy periods of time in our life or sometimes throughout Christmas or so we're super busy and we don't get to train as much as we do. How much do we really need in order to maintain our muscle?
yeah, if you want to maintain muscle, I mean, there's a lot of good studies coming out on this. It takes very little volume to actually maintain your muscle mass. Um, I mean, the research is suggesting, I mean, you can do as little as, a couple hard sets per week on a muscle group, and actually maintain your muscle mass, so I mean, it's literally very low volume, and you can maintain most, if not all, your muscle training that way, which is great, for anybody that's really busy and you're just like, well, I don't have the time right now to train to add a bunch of muscle, and that's okay. You can maintain on very, very little. And like I said, a few sets per week on per muscle group is really all you need just to maintain most of your muscle. So
I think one of the headlines that I saw on your page was something like a 50% training volume reduction might be enough for some. I think that's really great news.
yeah.
I do think that that should be also more seen as an encouragement to still do something instead of
Oh yeah.
thinking,
Yeah.
well, I'm so busy, I'm gonna not do anything for a while and then crack hard again in a few weeks' time. It's probably still better to train once a week or do three
Yeah.
20-minute sessions or so, just something very short.
Oh yeah. It's like sometimes you just do what you can. I mean, it's just like, I've got a couple kids, and they keep me really busy and stuff. And I have weeks where, I just go to the gym when I can. And, I've had weeks sometimes where I can only get to the gym once but it's fine because I know I'll be at least maintaining what I have. So, you know,
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's great news for everyone. But now if we want to gain muscle, there's also a lot of conflicting information out there. How much of a surplus should we go into? And I think in recent years, the word lean gaining has been thrown around more often than the dirty bulking or the glorious, I'm going to put so and so much on and then just to have to strip the fat back down again. What is your recommendation when it comes to that, or even what does the literature say?
yeah, it's tough to say because, in fact, I was just involved recently in a study with Eric Helms on this. And unfortunately, it was during COVID years. And so that kind of messed up our study protocol and we weren't able to, we had a lot of dropouts and everything. Um, but if you look at overall the data so far, this is what it seems to suggest. If you're a beginner or you're fairly early in your training career, you can get by with bigger surpluses, and it might be beneficial to have a somewhat larger surplus. But if you're a more advanced trainee, the dirty bulk is most likely just going to get you fat. You're not going to add more. It's not going to help you gain more muscle. Um, most of the data suggests now that you just need just pretty fairly small surplus. I mean, we're talking a surplus of maybe 1 to 200 calories per day, nothing big, and you'll be fine. Adding anything more than that seems to be just associated with extra fat gain. So if you're a more advanced trainee, I'd say the lean gaining, the lean bulking is probably going to be better for you than the dirty bulking. But if you're a beginner, if you're very early in your training career, you can get by with bigger surpluses, 400 or 500 calories per day surplus, and that might actually work better if you're early in your training career. So.
I actually think that that is really good news. And I mean, as a female, I'm maybe more inclined to like fearing a bit of like the recommendation of, oh, you need to put on a lot of weight or a lot of fat as well in order to gain more muscle. And I think something smaller might seem a little bit more attainable mentally as well for many people out there.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and a lot of times is you might be surprised if you just ate, unless you're one of these really skinny guys who can never eat. Most people, if they just eat ad libitum and they're not trying to get a surplus, chances are they'll eat enough to gain muscle anyway. I mean, God, I haven't even tracked my own calorie intake now for at least a couple years. But my training, I've still, I mean, I just turned 50 and I've still been setting some personal bests and stuff on, in the gym on some things. And I'm not tracking my calorie intake at all. And my body weight has slowly gone up, but it's been pretty slow. And I'm just eating ad libitum. I'm not trying to force feed. I'm not trying to eat a huge surplus or anything like that. And so I think a lot of people can even just get by with just ad libitum feeding and they'll probably be fine, so.
And you mentioned the pandemic, and that made me think of some lighter weight training, or also things like blood flow restriction work. And I saw that you've done some work on that as well. So maybe you can explain to people, number one, what that is, and then also potentially where its use might be found.
Oh yeah, so like one thing we know, and we know this from a bunch of data now, you can actually gain as much muscle with light weights as you can with heavy weights. I mean, weights up to like, let's say 30 reps to failure. You can actually put on just as much muscle as you can with, 8 to 12 reps or whatever to failure. And that's been shown in both beginners and advanced trainees. So it's not just beginners that happens in, it's also been shown in advanced trainees. And an alternative to that is also blood flow restriction, where you put a little kind of tourniquet thing on your arm, and you also do high reps, that way. The impact is fairly similar. It's not going to be superior to heavier training, but it's not inferior either. And so it's actually great for a couple of things. For example, people that have issues with injuries or something like that. The good news is, like, you can actually train with lighter weights and still gain muscle. Or if you're just like me, I mean, at 50 years old now, it's like, I have, joint issues and stuff from, years and, 20 years of training and stuff, especially when I was younger, training too heavy when I was younger and stuff. And, so, I mean, I have some exercises where I'll do, 20, 25 reps to failure or whatever. But I know that I can still put on just as much muscle, doing that. So now not everything lends itself to light weights to failure. Obviously, doing 30 rep squats to failure probably really sucks, and no one's going to want to do that. So, there's some practical things about that, but especially isolation movements or dumbbell movements, things like that. I mean, you can do, higher rep pump work and still gain just as much muscle. So I mean, yeah, it allows for a lot more variety in your training, and it gives you more alternatives for training around issues that you might have. So
Awesome. Yeah, I think, again, great news for people out there, or even I could imagine when traveling or so, taking a band with you, that's quite light. But what's the mechanism behind it? Why is it postulated to work just in the same way?
So it's really believed that if you take a lightweight to failure, your body's still, we think of slow twitch fibers and fast twitch fibers, and they more exist on a continuum. But so typically what happens is if I do a heavier weight to failure, let's say 8 reps to failure or whatever, almost all my muscle fibers are recruited from the very first rep. And so even if I don't quite get to failure, I mean, I'm going to have targeted, both my slow twitch and fast twitch fibers, equally. And stimulate hypertrophy, obviously, in those fibers. When you take a lightweight to failure, it's a little bit different, but the end result is the same. When you first start a lightweight set, it's your slow twitch fibers that are doing all the work because your fast twitch fibers don't need to take over yet. But as you get more fatigued and closer to failure, now you have to start recruiting those fast twitch fibers to keep the weight going, even though it's a light weight. And so by the time you get close to failure with that lightweight, you've still recruited and stimulated all those muscle fibers. So the end result is still the same. It's just the path you took is a little bit different.
Gotcha. So the blood flow restriction work would be nearly in the same mechanism as just a light.
Yes. Yeah. So what happens with the blood flow restriction work is it causes you to recruit those fast twitch fibers sooner than you normally would with a lightweight. But ultimately the mechanism is still overall the same. So
okay, awesome. I'm curious, are you looking into things related with intermittent fasting at all, whether that pertains to training or fat loss?
I mean, personally, I'm not, I know we've had some recent articles and reps about that stuff. I'm of the opinion with intermittent fasting, if you look at the overall body of data, it's just a way, it's just like low carb dieting. It's just another way, a tool that people can use to eat less. For some people, it works great. Other people, it won't. There's nothing magical about it. It's just if you cram your eating window into a shorter period of time, for some people, it's just harder. It's harder to overeat, right? So really, that's just what it comes down to. I know Grant Tinsley has done a lot of work on intermittent fasting, although I think his recent stuff has been more like body composition testing related. But I know, he might be working on some stuff as far as research wise. Like I said, I'm not really involved in any more research studies at this point. But I'm sure in reps we'll have more articles in the future, as more studies get published. So.
And anything clear as it pertains to hypertrophy and intermittent fasting?
So the current data seems to suggest that intermittent fasting does not interfere with hypertrophy, as long as you're still consuming enough calories and protein, that it shouldn't actually interfere with hypertrophy. So that's the good news. If you do like to follow an IF program, it shouldn't actually negatively affect your muscle building. Still, I'd like to see more data on that, but at least that's what the data seems to suggest so far. So
okay, yeah. What I have sometimes seen in more with my female clients is that if they forcefully try to do intermittent fasting, they have a hard time hitting their protein target just because, of course, if you only have 2, maybe 3 meals or 2 meals.
Oh, yeah.
And you're supposed to eat 150 grams of protein, that's where they then fall short. And then we get to the point of what you're saying, they're not reaching their protein and therefore potentially hindering their progress.
Yeah. And so it's just more of a practical issue, Now, obviously, if they can hit it, then it's not going to be a problem. But yeah, it just becomes more the pragmatic issue of trying to get your targets when your eating window is a lot smaller. So
yes, absolutely. Well, I mean, you mentioned that you're not involved in any current studies at the moment, but what's something about the research in exercise science and nutrition that excites you at the moment, or just in general with the practices that excite you at the moment?
I like some of the stuff that's been coming out on training. Recently you've got the stuff on length and partials, which has been kind of cool. There's been more cool volume research that's come out recently. That's the stuff that's kind of interesting to me. Some of those holes in our knowledge that still need to be filled. Nutrition um, hasn't been as interesting to me because I just feel like there's not as much stuff that we can learn, at least that's going to like suddenly change our minds about nutrition, right? I mean, what we know now isn't that much different from what we knew 5 years ago or whatever, as far as nutrition. I mean, there's been some cool stuff. Uh, uh, I can't remember his name. He's European researcher who's done a bunch of protein research, and he was involved in this one recent study where they looked at, because it used to be thinking like, oh, well, you got to split your protein up into 30, 40 grams per meal. You can't have more than that. And he basically debunked that idea with a recent study. That was a really cool study. If it's a steak or some really slow digesting protein, doesn't really matter.
I think they had
So yeah,
like
if
a
you're eating
hundred
whole
grams
food
of
protein,
protein in one sitting.
yeah, that was a really cool study. I'm glad, and so if you're eating mostly whole food sources of protein, then you don't need to be as precise. You don't have to be like, oh, 30 grams in this meal and 30 grams in this meal. Like you can kind of do whatever you want. Now obviously it might be different if you're getting all your protein from whey shakes or something like that. It might be different, but if it's a lot of whole food sources like meat and whatever, yeah, it probably doesn't. Your timing and that stuff probably doesn't matter too much. So that was a really cool study. Um, I think some of the ultra processed stuff, like the chewing thing that we're going to talk about in the next issue of Reps, some of that stuff's really cool. Kevin Hall is still doing some really cool stuff there. Um, but for me, I think a little bit more of the fascinating stuff has been the training stuff, the length and partials, some of the volume stuff that's come out, recently.
Anything on
Um,
proximity to failure that you're looking into, or that has been new to you in recent years?
Nothing really new. It seems to be, um, as long as you're training pretty hard and you can still leave a few reps in the tank and it's not going to really interfere with your muscle building. So I mean, you know uh if you can do 10 reps of something but to absolute failure and you just do 8, you're not really shortchanging yourself. You're still going to gain just as much muscle. There's no evidence that stopping a rep or two short is going to be, an issue. Um, and so, most of the data that's come out seems to point that way. Um, so there's nothing really I would say new along those lines. It seems like any of the studies that have been done seems to just kind of more confirm that general consensus there. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. Honestly, this has been great and very nice to just have some of the things laid out very clearly on what the research says at the moment. I will obviously link Weightology and link Reps Research Review in the show notes here as well. And of course, your Instagram as well, where you're putting out some helpful information. Anything else that you want to shout out?
No, I think you kind of just pretty much covered it there. So.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, truly. I very much enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.